Welcome to the Think Christian podcast. I'm Josh Larson, your host. I'm not a pastor, but you know I like to play one here, and you know what I like to preach. There's no such thing as secular, even in popular culture. So, pop culture does love its priests, pastors, clergy, men, and women. A lot of times uses those figures to stand in for the voice of God, or to play the moral police, or be pointed to as figures of hypocrisy. A few years ago, over at the TC website, Todd Hertz wrote an amusing article, The 5 Pastors You'll Meet in Hollywood. He broke down some of the more familiar archetypes there. That post was part of the inspiration for this episode. Once I knew I would have to talk about The VelociPastor, that's the 2019 joke movie I promised J.R. Forasteros I would watch if the TC podcast reached 70 reviews on Apple Podcasts. Once I knew I was going to be doing that, I figured we could revisit the topic of Hollywood clergy and pair VelociPastor with something else. And in this case, we're going to go with a favorite film of another TC podcast team member, Abiel Chessie. That movie, 1955's The Night of the Hunter, with Robert Mitchum as a murderous preacher. So we have a killer pastor and a dinosaur pastor. This should be interesting. Abby and JR are going to be here to help me figure out if there's anything instructive that we can learn from these movies about what it means to be a clergy person. Now, in the last episode, I did ask for listener suggestions for your favorite screen pastors, and we got this from Chad Sanders, who emailed us at tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. I immediately thought of Ron Glass's character on Firefly, Shepherd Book, the Christian monk-type guy with a mysterious past. He can philosophize about life's meaning one moment and kick your butt the next. Thank you for that, Chad. Other suggestions came in via Facebook and Twitter. You can find us there at Think Christian. We saw a couple of votes for Reverend Paul Coates in Broadchurch. Neil Sedgwick and TC podcaster Eric Danielson chimed in with Brendan Gleason's Father James in Calvary. Joel Mayward, who writes for TC on occasion, he offered Christian in Of Gods and Men for his humble courage, and the priest in Fleabag. You know who didn't get mentioned by anyone? Father Doug, the title character of the VelociPastor. I am joined by a giddy, dare I say giddy, J.R. Forasteros, along with Abiel Chessie. You look pretty pleased yourself, Abby, both of whom are here to help me fulfill my promise of watching and discussing The VelociPastor. How are you two?
I couldn't be better.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm going to let JR start. Yeah.
You're speechless.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this.
I'm excited for you. I'm also excited.
Josh, you know there was real debate about like how you would actually feel about this film.
Well, let's get into this, but maybe we'll start. Since you got me into this mess, JR, I'm going to let you set this up. So tell folks what The VelociPastor even is and how it came to be your favorite film of all time.
So The VelociPastor is a low-budget horror comedy that began as an autocorrect error when the director tried to type Velociraptor and it autocorrected to VelociPastor, and he laughed so hard he decided he needed to make a movie. So it was made for $35,000. I genuinely struggle with how to define it because a lot of people will say it's a bad movie, but it was clearly made with so much love and affection and joy. It's not like The Room in I think a lot of important ways. It's not like some of those other like classic so bad it's good. It's just like, for me, it's just a really fun, low budget horror comedy. And part of it, honestly, is just I've seen the movie probably 8-ish times now.
Oh my goodness!
And wow. every time I've watched it with people, and every time the reaction has just been rapturous joy. People just have so much fun with the movie that it remains a very, and it's also like 70 minutes long, right? So it's not even. It's not like you're sitting through a 3-hour thing and then deciding it's terrible. I also maintain that within the first 5 minutes, there is a gag that if it makes you laugh, you should keep going. And if not, you should abandon ship. So
I think I know what you mean. All right, Abby, what's your history with this curiosity? And since JR largely skipped over the plot, which I completely understand why, maybe you can fill in a little bit of that.
Yeah, it's so my history with this is all JR based. He brought it up at the retreat that we had back in October 2019, like ages ago, as just this great movie. And at the time, I figured that it was like Sharknado, like an intentionally bad. Like I wasn't quite sure what the production level was going to be. So he talked our friend Joe George and I into watching this with him. I think it was the first screening night that the three of us have had. We've since had like I think 3.
Nice.
And yeah, it's been really fun. So this was the movie that started that process for us, and we just had a really great time with it. It's I think you recognize immediately that it's not the kind of bad movie that you think it's going to be, and it just kind of keeps getting better from there. The plot, kind of in a nutshell,
Yeah.
and JR is laughing because is that a young priest who I think has just been ordained loses his parents in a car fire, and in his grief decides that he is going to go to China, which is a place that is he drives to China. Yeah, it's a place that is so far that God quote unquote can't follow, and if God finds him there, then his calling is meant to be intact. And while he is there, he comes into contact with an ancient dinosaur tooth, which turns him into basically like a were-velociraptor. When he gets super worked up or angry, he becomes a velociraptor and
fights ninjas.
Yeah, and so then he decides to after returning to his church, he decides to use that power to fight evil.
Yeah,
And
that's good.
that's
Nicely
the story.
done. I mean, we didn't really get into the ninjas or the evangelism cocaine conspiracy, but that's okay. We don't want to spoil everything. So I will say that even watching this alone during the day, which I know is not recommended, and even being skeptical of movies that are bad on purpose. I've seen some of these. I think one was called The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra.
The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra, yes.
Sometimes those like they reach a limit for me where I'd almost rather just be watching pure camp, which didn't mean to be bad. But I will say that I laughed quite a bit at this, even under all those circumstances. And maybe one of the elements that I appreciated the most were the montage sequences where the frame is broken up into different squares that are often moving around. And I just love, it's the silliness of that conceit on its own, but then how there'd always be one image in one frame that didn't make any sense with whatever else was going on. I think at one point it's like these stained glass shots, stained glass portraits of Jesus that would show up out of nowhere, completely inappropriate. There's some deranged artistry going on there on the part of Brendan Steer, who he wrote, he directed, and edited this as well. So I appreciated those. I think Father Doug, played by Greg Cohen, he's really funny, very funny. And I think he's a capable actor, it strikes me, who's giving 110% to silly material. And I think that's what you want for something like this, because you don't want someone trying to give a bad performance, right? And I think there are a few performances like that in this film. But it shows you that Greg Cohen's doing something different. You don't want someone trying to give a bad performance. You don't even necessarily want a bad actor, though that can be amusing too. But you want someone who's got the goods and is committing them to bad material, which is kind of what we have here. So, and then of course, don't forget, Matthew 32:6, very important verse. Very important verse for all of us to remember. So what were some of your favorite gags from both of you? Let's stick with you, Abby. Which ones did you enjoy the most?
I love the montage sequences as well. I think during there's like a love scene, and during the montage of that, for whatever reason, like in one of the corners of the montage, there's just the top of a soldier statue. It's like some kind of memorial. It references absolutely nothing. It's just there, like worked in with all of these other moments of the two of them like hanging out and eating ice cream and fighting evil. Yeah, that part is great. Father Stewart's flashback to Vietnam is also great. It's pretty explosive. I also love the fact that Father Stewart is the director's dad, right? Isn't that right,
Oh,
JR?
really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah,
Yep.
and he kind of exudes sort of a fatherly wisdom. I think I just find it extremely.
Does he?
I don't know. It's the intent is there. I don't know if it is in practice.
Yes. I'm going to put him, and I hope this isn't insulting, but I'm going to go ahead and put him in the bad actor category. And,
that's fair. Yeah, yeah.
And he's enjoyable on that level. I'll say that.
Exactly. Yeah, he's not a great actor. I think it just seems to me very sweet that this, like, if I asked my dad to be in a bad movie that I made, the answer would definitely be no. My mom might do it, but it's doubtful. I just think it's very sweet that Brendan Steere had this idea and recruited his dad, and his dad was just all in. I think that's lovely. So yeah, those are some of my favorite bits.
How about you, JR? I mean, having seen this multiple times, what's the one that always gets you?
I love that every single Bible verse is completely fabricated. Like it speaks to a level of intentionality that is aggressive, right? Like, It is not hard to just go find a Bible verse that says some of the things that they were wanting to say. But it's like, no. We want it to be very, very, very clear that, like, zero research went into this, either for dinosaurs or for religion, you know?
Yep.
It's hard not to love to hate Frankie Mermaid. That character is just so incredibly singular and awful. Loved that. And again, I think the car explosion, that's the thing that, like, right out of the gate, if that made you laugh, then like buckle in, you're good. If you were like, that is so dumb, you should just stop the movie and walk away.
It's kind of the movie putting its cards on the table right there. Like, this is what you're going to get.
Yeah, that was the moment that did it for me too. Because because up to that point, I wasn't sure what kind of bad movie we were in for. But as soon as that showed up, I was like, oh, okay, great. They know. We're in good hands.
Well, and it's interesting. So I got to attend the Texas premiere of this film at Texas Frightmare back in 2019. And I got to meet Brendan and Greg and Jesse, who is the cinematographer on the film, and talk with them and ask them all kinds of questions. And there was originally supposed to be an actual VFX fire there, but they did like an early screening of it, and everyone in the screening died laughing at that scene. So Brendan was like, okay, great, like, we'll leave it out. And then, he said about his dad, he said, every bad movie has one actor who is like so terrible that that they have to be related to the director, or the director owes them a favor or something. It's like, so I cast my dad as that, wanting that. And like, he was a little bit miffed because it's not that bad of a performance. Like, it's not a good performance, but like, it's not like glaringly terrible for the most part. I think what I love about the movie so much is, it's not trying to be bad. It's trying to be fun. And I feel like it's trying to invite you to have fun with it. And if you're there to have fun with it, I think you're gonna have a blast, And if you don't, then you won't.
Yeah. Well, and some of the examples we brought up, I think, speak to a thoughtfulness and an intentionality that you don't get in a lot of purposefully bad movies. So that's there, especially as you're talking. I'm thinking back to just how often the camera will kind of wander. It's like it gets distracted and wander up towards the sky in the middle of a shot, which is kind of a recurring motif. So yeah, there's good stuff like that in it. Now, I mean, can anything serious be taken from this exercise is kind of one question. You're the actual pastor, JR. So I wondered if any of this resonated. There's that whole line, plot line where Father Doug is encouraged to kind of use his dinosaur powers to take out evil people, to essentially be God's hand of judgment. I don't know if there's anything there about whether or not condemning should be part of a pastor's calling, or should we not even try to find anything of substance here? Would that be killing the fun?
No, I mean, I don't. I think that's still fun for me, and maybe it's because I'm a pastor, but I think any pastor worth their salt has these kinds of crises of faith that Doug experiences in the film. I mean, the loss of parents is a real trauma, and the inability for a pastor to affect any sort of like meaningful change in a community. I assume both of you have seen Calvary with Brendan Gleeson.
Yeah.
But that is something that film asks, is like, what's the point if these people are going to continue to be horrible? If they're going to continue to be like aggressively human, then what's the point of even pastoring? And I mean, in a way, VelociPastor asks that same question, except you're asking it of a priest who now is a were-raptor. right? And who
Right.
now can actually do something Dexter-ish, right? Where it's like, it's fine if I'm killing, if I'm only killing people who kill people. I mean, no one, I think, was upset when Frankie Mermaid got his comeuppance. Like, everyone sort of felt that was, and one of the things I noticed on, my multiple rewatches was he's like the only character in the film who is truly vulgar. And he is very vulgar.
Yeah.
But he's the only one. And I can't help but think that part of that is so that we feel like he deserves it. The film has so little time to establish how rotten he is. Something of the same way that Deadwood is such a show that has so much coarse and crass language. They said that was to like really make you feel like you were out beyond the boundaries of what was, kind of in the Wild West of TV. And in some way, I think Frankie Mermaid was that way. And yeah, like I think any pastor who has done ministry in any kind of real context for any time knows that there are people like that where you just don't know how to reach them, how to help them. You don't know how to be a force for good in your community when there are these like ongoing, real systemic problems. And I think I will certainly admit that if I had the power to be a were-raptor, like it caused me to have some second thoughts about the way I do ministry, So, I mean, it's silly, but I think those are real questions that the film lightly dances around while giving us in the end, like the full raptor experience we showed up for.
So yeah, maybe after 8 viewings, new levels, new depths of
That's
meaning,
it, man.
meaning
There's
arise,
layers here.
right?
Yeah.
Anything we didn't cover about it, Abby? Are you going to be watching this annually or try to hit 8 viewings?
I don't know if I'll hit 8 viewings, but I would watch this with people as soon as we can do that again, digitally, as I have done, and that was a lot of fun too. Another thing that kind of pops for me is that, like, if you've seen movies like I think Brigsby Bear is an example, and Son of Rambo is another example of like people who love the medium of movies and they want to make their own thing, and the thing that they make is maybe not great, but it's a thing that they love doing, and it's like it's up to their skill level and their resource level, the thing that they create. I feel like VelociPastor is a real life example of that. Like, if he were to be present during the making of this movie, it would not be dissimilar from some of those stories. And I think there's a lot of joy in that. I think we talk about maybe like the joy of creation, like a holy joy in creation and having fun and reveling in the abilities that God has given you. I think maybe there's an example to be found in this too, that these guys clearly were having a lot of fun, and they made something that they knew was up to the resources and skill level that they had, and they had as much fun possible making it. And that is evident, I think, when you watch it.
Yeah, maybe the distinction between derision and affection. Like, there's clear affection even for these bad movies that they're somewhat mimicking, as opposed to just being derisive about them.
Yeah, they're absolutely doing it because they love those things.
That reminds me, and this is something that I know very, very little about, but there's a filmmaker in Nigeria who is making like all of these pretty complex and complicated like action films, but they are all like exceedingly low budget. And from what I understand, a number of like film folk just find his stuff so compelling for exactly the reasons, Abby, you were just talking about, right? Like he is doing something very impressive given the limitations of his context and his funding,
Yeah.
So,
Hadn't heard about that. I'll have to check that out. All right. So, I can't say VelociPastor my biggest cinematic blind spot, but I am glad that I filled it in. So thank you for that. JR, Abby, thank you for playing along. Maybe we'll take some time to gather ourselves after that experience, and then we'll come back to talk The Night of the Hunter. Okay.
Absolutely.
yeah.
Hi, Josh Larson here. Quick interruption. We are trying a new video format for this episode, and as can sometimes happen with new technology, we ran into a few glitches. So later in this upcoming conversation, toward the end, probably 5 minutes left, my video went out, which means my face will disappear from the camera. You'll survive. We'll put up maybe a mugshot of me there in its place temporarily. And that's what you'll get on the YouTube version of this episode. Now, why are we telling you, the audio listener, this? Well, it messed up the audio as well. So the quality is not so great for the last couple of minutes of this conversation. But we didn't want you to miss out on it. So bear with us. We will clean that up for our next show. Thank you for your patience. And yeah, let's get back to the episode. Welcome back to the TC Podcast. I'm Josh Larson. From a monster piece to a masterpiece, we're going to try to balance out the VelociPastor with an all-time classic, 1955's The Night of the Hunter. This is the only film directed by actor Charles Laughton. It's based on a novel by Davis Grubb. J.R. Forsteros and Abby Olcese are back with me. And Abby, this one, a movie beloved by you. So maybe fill listeners in on the basic story and then touch on one question I think we should consider. Can Robert Mitchum's Harry Powell, can he really count as a pastor, would you say?
That's a good question. And I think, we can get into the details of that. I really thought about when we were creating the ideas for this podcast, like, is favorite fictional pastor, like, is that a fit? Because he's not a good pastor.
No.
So to fill folks in, The Night of the Hunter follows Robert Mitchum's character, Harry Powell, who is a itinerant preacher. And he, we'll say, funds his ministry by marrying widows and killing them for their money. And when the film opens, he has just been arrested for stealing a car and put in jail. And he ends up in jail with a character named Ben Harper, played by Peter Graves, who is going to be put to death for, he committed a robbery and shot a man and killed a man during the robbery. So he's about to be put to death. And Harry knows that Ben is leaving behind a widow, and he also is leaving behind 2 children, and they're going to need somebody to take care of them, presumably. And he's also leaving behind the loot from the robbery. It's hidden somewhere on his property. So as soon as Ben dies and Harry is let out of jail, he goes to the small town where Ben's wife, Willa, played by Shelley Winters, and she's just kind of guilt-ridden after Ben's death. She thinks that it is her fault that he stole the money, which is not true. And she is kind of guilted into sort of taking Harry as a suitor and then a husband, much to the dismay of her 2 young children, who are the only people who know where the money is hidden. So Harry, after he marries Willa, he tries to basically torture the information out of the children. The children eventually escape, and they take to the river and end up in the care of a woman named Rachel, played by Lillian Gish, who, like Harry, is also a Christian, but is much more loving and accepting and has a big group of foster kids of her own. And so she adds John and Pearl, the 2 kids, to her foster brood and protects them when Harry comes a-calling.
Yeah. So how about you, JR? Was this your first time watching The Night of the Hunter? And what'd you make of it? What'd you make of Powell as a pastor figure?
Yeah. So I honestly, to my shame, the first time I heard of this film was when Abby had written a piece for it for Ebert, right?
Yeah. Back in November.
So I actually still haven't read that piece because I thought I needed to watch the movie first. I started to, and I was like, I'm going to wait. And so then this was a perfect excuse. I actually watched it yesterday and had no idea what to expect. Like I didn't even know until you recommended it for this recording that it involved a pastor. I knew I was going to plan on watching it. So once I'd made that decision, I was like, I'm going to just like stay away from anything that I could possibly learn about it. Fascinated by the opening monologue that he does where he's talking to God, and then all of his justifications for the way he pastors and his religion, and all of that, and the particular historical setting of it as well, that it is a film made in the 50s, set in the 30s. And like just thinking about history of American religion at that time and what this guy sort of embodies about that era. And I was texting Abby as I was watching it. And like probably it was before the mom is killed. I texted her like, why is this not required viewing in seminary? Because he is such a quintessential spiritual abuser. And that is such a prevalent issue in the church today that it was frankly like disheartening to see that like whoever wrote this novel was operating out of a playbook that has not changed like even one iota in the time since it came out, since this film came out. A lot of the tactics that we see him employing are still employed in churches all over the country to manipulate people, to to get them to follow pastors blindly, not ask questions, to consolidate their power. I didn't love the end. I thought it kind of felt a little bit meandering, but it was good. And certainly, I've already told my wife that we've got to watch it while my rental window is still live. So I'm really looking forward to revisiting the film. Yeah, it's incredibly rich. I thought it was just terrific.
Does spiritual abuser sound right to you, Abby, to describe Powell instead of a pastor?
Yeah, absolutely. He's a big time spiritual abuser.
Well, I think unfortunately it's both. He does pastor, but he pastors in a way that is abusive. You know,
he preaches. And again, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm, he does. Yeah. And there's a couple of moments. There's a revival meeting scene that I think is super telling, where he's leading a revival, and Willa gets up to kind of give her testimony, and she yells all of these like really blatant untruths about how Ben stole the money and why he stole the money. And you realize that these are things that she believes, that nobody has told her otherwise. And Harry knows all that information because he knew Ben. He was with Ben, and he knows why he stole that money. And we know why he stole that money. Like at any point, he could tell her that wasn't the case. But of course, that would give her some kind of autonomy that would let her off the hook a little bit, and he wouldn't be able to control her. So he doesn't. So that obviously is not very godly behavior, but it's very abusive behavior. It definitely benefits him. I wrote this in the Ebert article that, I mean, I'm not going to presume to judge the souls of people I don't know, but there are some pretty prominent leaders in evangelical Christianity who in the last several years have come under scrutiny for fairly similar behavior. So I think it's pretty easy to see Harry present in a lot of public figures. I think the more that I think about that movie, the more I see him everywhere.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth noting the context in which this movie was made, which JR, you might find interesting, talking about the spiritual abuse category. So Charles Laughton chose to make this project because he was a gay man, closeted gay man, and felt that he had been burned by the church. And so he took on this project because he was interested in its themes of religious hypocrisy specifically. But the thing that I find fascinating about it is that, I mean, there are two forms of faith in the film. And so whether or not he realized it, he still made, I think, a pro-Christianity movie. He just pointed out a very specific and prevalent form of it that is abusive and bad, and a quieter, less obvious form of it, which is much closer to my own experience with the church, which is rich and life-affirming and good in the form of Rachel. And he has basically these two opposing forces go head to head in the final third of the film.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of answers that question of whether Powell is a pastor at the start, when it begins with Rachel Cooper quoting Matthew 7:15, I think it is. And that verse in Matthew exists, by the way, unlike in VelociPastor. But when she's quoting that, it's about false prophets. So right away at the beginning, the movie is kind of making that identification. And then I would argue, the real pastor in the movie is Rachel Cooper.
Oh, yeah.
And think about the ways she is pastoral, expressly pastoral, the way she cares for the kids, John and Pearl, as well as the other orphans in her home. She's a preacher too, reading that scripture at the start of the movie, and later she's reading to the children and talking about Moses, baby Moses. And I really love the moment this time I noticed with Ruby, a teenager who's in her care. She confesses to Rachel that she went out to meet Harry Powell, who's, this seductive figure. I mean, a number of women in the movie kind of fall for him, including this teenager. And Ruby confesses this to Rachel. And how does Rachel respond? With like this real pastoral grace and understanding. I think she says something like, "We all need love, Ruby."
And you were looking for love in the only foolish way you knew how. Yeah.
Yep.
It's really lovely.
And then the showcase sequence for me is doing exactly what you're talking about, Abby, bringing these two sides of this religious coin together when Powell is outside the house singing, leaning on the everlasting arms, very insinuatingly, very threateningly. And Rachel joins in, and it's a duet. And she just, it's kind of her way of reclaiming the gospel there. Is she's going to take it back and do what you're describing, is show what it really means in opposition to how he's presenting it. So, yeah.
And I love the way that is set up like throughout the movie. So like the leaning on the everlasting arms is like Harry's musical calling card. Like he sings it right after he's killed Willa. Like you see the body first and then you hear the song and then it transitions to him. Like as if there was any doubt in your mind as to what happened and what's going to happen next. And it happens again when the kids are on the run and they hear him from a distance singing it. Like it becomes this kind of Freddy Krueger based sort of a thing where like he's coming or he's done something when you hear the song. And so to have that be reclaimed in that moment is super powerful because like she's taking not only control of like the gospel narrative back, but she's taking control of that tool. Like that's not a tool that you can use to torture or harm people. It's a tool of love.
So I want to hear, especially from you, JR, how the filmmaking struck you, because it is so unique. And especially I think it begins this way, that sequence when the kids go on the run, they're in a boat going down a river, and it kind of transitions into this dreamlike, mystical state. I mean, this is a movie with such a strong aesthetic vision for a first-time director who then didn't go to make anything else. What did you make of that element of it?
I think for a film where the narrative really didn't follow like what we have been programmed into with like a very simple, clean 3-act structure, I was never questioning who I was supposed to be caring about, what the sides were, what the emotional stakes of the scene were. You know what I mean? Like, for a film that very much does not feel like a contemporary film, I as someone who's very much a contemporary film consumer, did not have any trouble following the film. And I certainly can't say that about some other films that are either international films or older films that are, from a different time or a different culture. It was so immediate and it was so easy for me to be present to what the film was inviting me into. And I think that all had to do so much with exactly what you were talking about.
Yeah, it's kind of its own time and place. It's so heightened, and the use of silhouettes and all of these elements, this German expressionism touch that comes in every once in a while. It's so much its own thing. I can see that. 1955. It doesn't feel like it's a 1955 film.
Yeah, I think audiences definitely weren't ready for it either. It did not do well in the theaters, which is why Charles Laughton never got to make another movie.
Really? Wow. Yeah, so when did it like become a classic? I mean, I know that's a weird question.
That's an excellent question. I don't know. It got a Criterion release within like the last 20 years. And I became aware of it first in high school. It was a Bravo countdown program of like the 100 scariest movie moments. And like that was, so it was considered a classic by then because like Rob Reiner and Mark Kermode were talking about it. So like it was around.
It's interesting. I don't know if this is the scene, but the visual that remains the two that remain the most striking to me are when the uncle looks down into the water and sees like so like clear, almost like a painting, like I assume it's his sister. It's Willa in the car. But the other one is when he's chasing the kids out of the cellar and his hands like turn into claws and there's like the shadow behind, and it becomes he very much in that moment embodies the monstrous nature that has been to that point hidden behind his humanity, and it almost is cartoonish in like, I mean that in a literal way, not in a metaphorical way, where like, and a lot of times in cartoons when someone's chasing, like you see them sort of elongate into the chase, and it had that sort of a feeling in a way that was like I found very disturbing, very scary.
Yeah, Laughton never lets you forget that he's a monster, like not for a second. And like there are some parts where he could be like considered, I don't know, like roguishly charming, maybe if you're into murderers. But like those moments are just like, when he's chasing them up the stairs, when he loses them in the river and like lets out this kind of inhuman guttural moan. And there's even like a scene with pitchforks and torches at the end. So it's just like, there are parts that are like Universal monster movie where it's like, this is a monster, but he's also a person who represents real beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's part of the greatness of Mitchum's performance too, is that he's monstrous, but you also see that he clearly believes this. He believes he's talking to God. This isn't really a con. I don't think he's that, off the path. Yet he is, as I said, very seductive, and he has a charisma to him and a charm. And when he sings, it's beautiful. I mean, it's scary, but it's also beautiful. So it's really quite a performance. So yeah, revisiting something, a movie that I've seen a couple times, it's always interesting if you look for something that might jump out at you new this time. Did you have anything like that, Abby?
I don't know. I feel like my favorite bits I have written about so much that they just are like the things that come out by default. But I did appreciate the last time that I watched this. I did watch it with friends who knew that I loved this movie but hadn't seen it. One of them was like lapsed Christian. The other was a lifelong atheist. And when we first meet Rachel, and she says, "What is it? I'm a strong tree with branches for many birds." They both just looked at me and were like, "Wow!" And I think it's a lovely line, and it's really touching. And I think I had watched the movie so many times that I had forgotten how moving that is. But like that's what we're called to do. We're called to be strong trees with branches for many birds, and it's such a lovely upfront description of who she is and what motivates her and what form her faith takes.
Yeah, that strength is so evident in Gish's performance. Even though she is this smaller woman, this older woman, she communicates that strength whenever she's on screen. Yeah, I think the thing that popped out for me is probably related to what we were talking about in terms of spiritual abuse is just, I was struck by how much misogyny plays a part in Harry Powell's psychological makeup.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually his theology too. We see him, I'd forgotten that we see him early on at a burlesque show and he's just seething in his chair as he's watching the woman dance. Prayer he offers at one point, really blood curdling about the things you hate, Lord, lacy things with curly hair. I mean, pretty much they're just declaring God hates women. That's what the claim he's making. And I think this is a guy who just doesn't know how to process his own sexuality. Like, why was he at that burlesque show in the first place? And he ends up just distorting, things into this strange purity culture theology that sees women in and of themselves as sinful. So I think that kind of connects with the spiritual abuse you guys were touching on.
Yeah, I wanted to note the movie Promising Young Woman makes two references to Night of the Hunter, which I watched this with the same people, and as soon as that popped up, they both looked at me like, "You planned this, right?" And I was like, "No, I really didn't." But it is those scenes. It's the one. It's particularly the scene where like his misogyny is just like put all out on the table. And then again, I think there's like a moment of like emotional distress where it brings back one of the musical kind of surreal moments of it. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the role of that is in that movie. I think it is just like pointing out the misogynistic elements of that particular form of purity culture. But I do love that it's there. So that made me very happy.
Yeah, Jeffrey Overstreet pointed that out too when I was logging Night of the Hunter on Letterboxd. That was the first thing he said in a comment is, "Why do you think this showed up in Promising Young Woman?" But I think you're dead on there, Abby.
I think back to your point about purity culture, Josh, and his like very strange faith, which it's clear in the very first scene where we meet him that he has constructed this out of a personal relationship with God, right? But I think it's really telling that he, except when he's giving his one sermon that he knows about his tattoos, he never actually cites scripture.
Mm-hmm.
He never even really references scripture. It's all of these cultural things like you hate lace and curly hair and all of that. And when we counter that with Rachel at the end, she is constantly, even the I'm a many branches for many birds is a specific reference to Jesus's parable of the mustard seed. It says even though it's the smallest seed, going back to that weakness and smallness, when it grows, it's the biggest in the garden and many birds can nest in it. She's talking about Herod and baby Jesus when Meacham comes for them. She's talking about baby Moses. And like she is constantly directing the kids back to specific scripture and teaching them to understand their world through the lens of scriptural imagination. And Meacham is not. And I think that's in large part because his faith is so individualistic and untethered from anything that resembles Christianity that's informed by scripture. And I think, again, that should be a warning call for us about how easy it is to assume that Christian culture is Christian when actually they begin to diverge fairly quickly and can become entirely different animals.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, another distinction it seems to be between them is his faith is defined by what he's against, and hers is defined often by what she is for, and she finds what she's for in Scripture, in those examples that you're giving. Yeah. Well, thanks again to you both. Really glad we got to talk about this one. JR and Abby, let listeners know where people can follow both of you, keep up with your work. Maybe, Abby, you go ahead first.
For sure. You can follow me on Twitter at Abby Olcese, ABBYOLCESE. I will have a article on movies to watch at home for Lent coming out on TC here pretty soon.
That's right.
Yeah. And if you want to check out my full piece on Night of the Hunter on the Roger Ebert website, it's up at rogerebert.com. You can just search for Night of the Hunter and it should pop up.
Yeah, we'll link to that too in the show notes for this episode. How about you, JR?
I am at JR Foresteros anywhere that I put anything up. So,
there you go.
If you can't find me there, it means I probably don't have an account there. So Twitter, Facebook, all that. I don't think I have anything in the pipe for TC, which means I probably need to get back to work.
Yeah.
So.
I'll just say this. I think we have the VelociPastor covered. So
okay. All right.
maybe something in another direction.
Okay. Well, that'll save me a 9th viewing, I guess.
All right. Thanks, you guys. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you, Josh.
So, yeah, not always the most flattering portraits of clergy men and women when you look to TV, to movies, or to songs. But every once in a while, we're blessed with a Rachel Cooper in The Night of the Hunter who hopefully more resembles the faithful pastors we know in our lives. Now, I mentioned Todd Hertz's TC article, 5 Pastors You'll Meet in Hollywood. We'll link to that in the show notes, and you can find it over at thinkchristian.net. If you want to be sure never to miss a TC article, you can subscribe to receive our emails over at thinkchristian.net/subscribe. Now, lastly, just because we hit that 70 review mark on Apple Podcasts doesn't mean that we couldn't use a few more. If you haven't left a review yet, please do take a minute and give us a rating, maybe even a comment or two. It does really help to raise our profile over on Apple Podcasts. The Think Christian Podcast is a production of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more info. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor, that's John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Baslin. Thanks so much for listening. We're going to be back in a couple of weeks to consider how another aspect of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.